In April 1483 a messenger rode north from Westminster, carrying news that would fracture the political order of England within weeks. Edward IV, who had ruled for more than 2 decades and had survived wars, betrayals, and multiple attempts to unseat him, was dead. He had fallen ill suddenly, possibly from a stroke, and within days he was gone. He was 40 years old. His death was so unexpected that no one had prepared for it, and the kingdom he left behind was far more unstable than it appeared. The succession itself was clear in law. His 12-year-old son Edward, Prince of Wales, would become king, but succession in law and succession in practice were not the same thing in 15th century England. The mechanisms that would govern the realm during the boy's minority were uncertain, contested, and vulnerable to seizure by whoever moved first and moved decisively. Edward IV had left a will designating his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during his son's minority. But he had also left behind a queen who had no intention of allowing her brother-in-law to dominate the regency, a court divided by factional rivalries that had been suppressed only by Edward's personal authority, and a nobility that understood exactly how unstable a child's reign could become. The moment Edward died, every political calculation changed, and the contest for control began immediately. The young king was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Richard of Gloucester was at his estates in Yorkshire, more than 200 miles to the north. The Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, was in London, surrounded by her family, and by courtiers who had risen with them during Edward's reign. Geography mattered, and it mattered urgently. Whoever controlled the boy controlled the crown, and whoever reached London first with the king in their custody would shape the terms of the regency. The Woodvilles understood this, and they moved quickly. Rivers prepared to bring the young king to London for his coronation, which was scheduled for early May. The plan was straightforward: move swiftly, crown the boy, and establish a council-led regency in which the queen and her family would have significant influence. If they could accomplish this before Gloucester arrived and asserted his authority, his role as Lord Protector would be diminished, reduced to one voice among many, rather than the dominant force in government. It was a reasonable strategy, and under different circumstances it might have worked, but it required speed, coordination, and an assumption that Gloucester would either accept the situation or be outmaneuvered before he could respond effectively. Gloucester did neither. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand the depth of the factional divisions that had developed during Edward's reign. The Woodville family's rapid ascent had been one of the defining features of the previous 2 decades, and it had created resentments that ran deep among the older nobility. Elizabeth Woodville had been a widow with 2 children when Edward married her in secret in 1464, a decision that had shocked the political nation and alienated key figures at court who had expected the king to make a diplomatic marriage with a foreign princess. Her family was not without standing. Her father had been a knight who had married well and had eventually been created Earl Rivers, but the title was new and the pedigree was modest by the standards of the great magnate families. When Edward elevated the Woodvilles into the highest circles of power, it was perceived by many as favoritism rather than merit. Over the years, Elizabeth's relatives had accumulated offices, lands, and titles with a speed that suggested they were profiting from the king's affection for his queen, rather than earning advancement through service to the Yorkist cause. Her brother Earl Rivers had become one of the wealthiest men in England. Her sons from her first marriage held significant positions at court and in the provinces, and the Queen herself, as the mother of the heir to the throne, occupied a position of immense potential influence in any regency government. This accumulation of power and wealth bred hostility. The Woodvilles were seen as outsiders, upstarts who had used a royal marriage to enrich themselves at the expense of families who had fought for the Yorkist cause from the beginning. They were resented by nobles whose lineages stretched back centuries and who believed that their blood and their service entitled them to precedence. This resentment had been suppressed during Edward's lifetime by his authority and by the stability his rule had brought after years of civil war, but it had not disappeared, and the moment Edward died, it became a political force that could be mobilized. Richard of Gloucester understood this, and he understood how to use it. He could position himself not simply as the rightful Lord Protector, according to his brother's will, but as a counterweight to the Woodvilles, a defender of proper governance against a faction that was widely perceived as greedy and self-serving. Whether he believed this himself, or whether it was simply effective political positioning, is impossible to determine.
What matters is that it gave him a narrative that resonated with much of the nobility, and it made his actions easier to justify. Richard had spent most of the previous decade governing the north of England, a region where the threat of Scottish incursion was constant, and where the great Percy family required a counterweight to maintain royal authority. He had performed that role with considerable skill, building relationships with the local gentry, dispensing justice, and maintaining order in ways that earned him genuine loyalty. He had also cultivated a reputation for piety, for competence, and for a certain principled severity that distinguished him from the more flexible and pragmatic figures at court. His distance from London had allowed him to avoid the factional infighting that characterized the Woodville years, and it had given him a power base that was independent of the southern nobility and the court establishment. When he received news of his brother's death, he acted with speed and precision. He sent word to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, one of the wealthiest magnates in the realm. Buckingham had been marginalized during Edward's reign despite his ancient lineage and his vast estates. He was married to a Woodville daughter, but he had no affection for his in-laws, and he saw in Gloucester's ascent an opportunity to restore his own influence. The two men coordinated their movements south, and they did so in ways that suggest careful planning rather than improvisation. Earl Rivers, meanwhile, was escorting the young king toward London with an escort of perhaps 300 men. It was a force large enough to signal authority, but not so large as to appear threatening, or to provoke alarm among the nobility who were watching events unfold. Rivers was an experienced diplomat, a cautious man, and he understood that the appearance of moderation was important. He sent messages ahead to the Queen, keeping her informed of their progress, and he maintained a measured pace that would bring the king to London in late April. On the 29th of April, Rivers and the king's party stopped for the night at Stony Stratford, a market town in Buckinghamshire about 50 miles northwest of London. Gloucester and Buckingham, who had been moving south on parallel routes, arrived the same evening and lodged nearby. The meeting was arranged to appear cordial. Gloucester greeted his nephew formally, explained that he had come to escort him to London as was his duty as Lord Protector, and dined with Rivers and the other members of the escort. The atmosphere by all accounts was civil and even friendly. But the following morning everything changed. Gloucester arrested Rivers, along with the King's Chamberlain, Sir Thomas Vaughan, and the Queen's younger son from her first marriage, Sir Richard Grey. The charges were vague, that they had conspired to exclude Gloucester from his rightful role as Lord Protector and to govern in their own interest, marginalising the King's lawful uncle and disrupting the proper order of the Regency. No evidence was presented, and no legal process was followed, but legality was not the point. The point was control. By arresting Rivers and his companions, Gloucester removed the Woodville leadership from the king's entourage and assumed personal custody of Edward V. The young king, who had spent his entire life under Woodville care and guidance, was now in the hands of an uncle he barely knew, and he was being told that the men he trusted had been plotting against the realm. Contemporary sources suggest that he protested, possibly in tears, but his protests were ignored. Rivers and his companions were sent north under armed guard, eventually to Yorkshire, where they would be held in castles controlled by Gloucester's retainers. The escort that had accompanied the king from Ludlow was dismissed, and the party continued toward London with Gloucester and Buckingham in command. This was a calculated act of political aggression, and it carried enormous risk. Gloucester had no legal authority to arrest Rivers at this point. The Protectorate had not yet been formally established by the Council, and even if it had been, the power to arrest and imprison subjects of the realm required judicial process, not summary action on a public road. If the Council in London had rejected Gloucester's actions, if the Queen had been able to mobilise support, if Rivers' allies in the south had raised forces to contest the seizure, Gloucester could have found himself in an untenable position. He could have been branded as a usurper and a kidnapper of the king, but he gambled that the Woodvilles' unpopularity would work in his favour, that the council would accept the fait accompli rather than risk civil conflict, and that speed and decisiveness would prevent resistance from coalescing before it could become effective. He was right. When news of the arrest reached London, Queen Elizabeth immediately understood what had happened and what it meant. She took her younger son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters, and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was an ancient right, recognised by both church and crown, that protected individuals from arrest within certain sacred precincts. It was also an admission of defeat. By seeking sanctuary, Elizabeth was acknowledging that the political situation had moved beyond her control, and that she no longer trusted the mechanisms of government to protect her family. Gloucester arrived in London on the 4th of May with the king in his custody, and the council, faced with the reality of his control over the person of the monarch, confirmed him as Lord Protector. The Woodvilles had been outmanoeuvred, and their power had collapsed in less than a week, but Gloucester's position, though dominant, was not yet secure. He controlled the king, but the king's younger brother remained in sanctuary, beyond his reach, and as long as the boy was there, he represented a potential rallying point for opposition. The coronation was still scheduled for late June, and once Edward V was crowned, the protectorate would theoretically end. Gloucester would retain influence, certainly, but he would no longer have the automatic authority that came with governing in the king's name during a minority. He would become one voice among many in a conciliar government, and the Woodvilles, though weakened, had not been destroyed. There were also tensions within the political nation that were not immediately visible, but that threatened to fracture Gloucester's coalition. Some lords had supported him because they distrusted the Woodvilles, but that did not mean they supported a permanent concentration of power in his hands. And there were rumours circulating in the capital, whispers about his intentions, about the fate of the arrested men, about what he planned to do once the coronation had passed. In mid-June, Gloucester moved to preempt one of these potential threats. He arrested Lord Hastings during a council meeting at the Tower of London on charges of conspiracy, and had him executed the same day in the courtyard outside. Hastings had been one of Edward IV's closest advisers, a man who had served the Yorkist cause loyally through its darkest moments, and his execution without trial was a shock to contemporaries. It was also a signal. It demonstrated that Gloucester would tolerate no opposition, real or imagined, and that he was prepared to use lethal force preemptively. The speed and brutality of the act suggested something else as well, that Gloucester's hold on power was less certain than it appeared, and that he felt compelled to eliminate threats before they could materialize. Around the same time, he persuaded the council to demand that the Queen release her younger son from sanctuary to join his brother in the Tower. The argument was that the boy needed to be present for the coronation, and that it was inappropriate for a royal child to remain in sanctuary when there was no immediate threat to his safety. The bishops applied pressure, and Elizabeth, isolated and without leverage, eventually relented. Richard, Duke of York, was brought to the Tower of London to join his brother. The Tower was both a royal residence and a fortress, and it was customary for kings to lodge there before their coronations, but it was also a place from which escape was impossible without the cooperation of those who controlled the gates. Once both boys were inside, they were entirely within Gloucester's custody, and the Woodville family had lost the last piece of leverage they possessed. And then, in late June, the political situation transformed completely. A clergyman named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross, the public preaching ground outside St. Paul's Cathedral, in which he announced an extraordinary claim, that the late Edward IV had been contracted to marry another woman before he wed Elizabeth Woodville, and that this prior contract invalidated his marriage to Elizabeth. If the marriage was invalid, then the children born of that union were illegitimate, and if the children were illegitimate, they could not inherit the throne. The argument rested on a technical but consequential point of canon law. A binding marriage contract, even one made privately and without formal witnesses, created an impediment to any subsequent marriage in the eyes of the Church. Such contracts were legally recognised in the 15th century, though they were difficult to prove and often contested. If Edward had indeed contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler before his secret wedding to Elizabeth Woodville, and if that contract had never been dissolved, then his marriage to Elizabeth was void from the start. Every child born of that union was illegitimate under both canon and civil law. Lady Eleanor Butler had been a real person. She had been at court during the relevant period in the early 1460s, and she had died in 1468, several years after Edward's marriage to Elizabeth. She could not testify, and there was no surviving documentary evidence of any contract. The claim appears to have been based on testimony from Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, who may have claimed to have witnessed the contract or been told of it, but the details were murky and the evidence was thin. What was not thin was the political utility of the argument. It provided a legal mechanism for removing the princes from the succession without killing them, and it did so in a way that invoked the authority of the Church and the established traditions of matrimonial law. It transformed what might otherwise have appeared as naked usurpation
into a legal correction, a restoration of proper order after years of irregular succession. Within days, the argument was formalized in a parliamentary document known as Titulus Regius, the royal title. This statute was not merely a declaration of fact, it was an act of legal reconstruction, a deliberate use of law to redefine legitimacy and to justify a transfer of power that would otherwise have lacked any constitutional basis. The document rehearsed the claim about Edward's pre-contract with Lady Eleanor Butler, declared his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, pronounced all children of that marriage illegitimate and therefore incapable of inheriting, and recognized Richard of Gloucester as the rightful heir to the throne according to the laws of succession. The statute also included additional charges: that Edward's marriage had been conducted in secret without the counsel of the great lords of the realm, and that it had been entered into through sorcery and witchcraft, practised by Elizabeth Woodville and her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. These latter accusations were legally less important but served a clear political purpose. They framed the Woodville marriage as not only invalid in form, but corrupt in character. They positioned Richard not as a usurper, but as a corrective, a return to legitimate governance after years of deviation. Parliament endorsed the statute with little recorded dissent. The bishops, who might have been expected to examine the canonical arguments more closely, acquiesced. The lords, faced with a choice between accepting Richard's claim and risking civil conflict, chose acceptance. This outcome was not a foregone conclusion, and it cannot be explained simply by deception or coercion. The men who made up Parliament were not fools. They understood that the evidence for the pre-contract was weak and that the timing was transparently convenient, but they also understood the alternatives. Richard controlled the capital, the military forces of the realm, and the persons of the princes. He had demonstrated through the arrest of Rivers and the execution of Hastings that he was willing to use force to secure his position. He also had the support of Buckingham, one of the wealthiest magnates in the kingdom, and the loyalty of the northern gentry, who saw him as their patron and protector.
For the lords and bishops assembled in Parliament, the question was not whether the pre-contract claim was true in some objective sense. The question was whether opposing it was worth the cost. Many of them had lived through the Wars of the Roses, and they understood that prolonged civil conflict destroyed estates, disrupted trade, and created conditions in which no one was secure. If accepting Richard's claim meant avoiding another round of warfare, and if it provided a legal framework that could be presented as legitimate, then perhaps it was the prudent choice. There was also the reality that the princes, even if they had remained legitimate heirs, were children, and regency governments were notoriously unstable, prone to faction and vulnerable to external threats. Richard, for all the irregularity of his accession, was an adult with military experience and administrative competence. He promised stability, and stability was a rare and valuable commodity in 15th century England. These considerations help explain why resistance to Richard's coronation was limited, and why the political nation, for the moment, acquiesced. On the 6th of July 1483 Richard was crowned as Richard III, but his position, even after the coronation, remained vulnerable. The princes had been declared illegitimate by statute, but they were still alive, still royal by blood, and still potential focal points for anyone who wished to challenge Richard's rule. The law had removed them from the succession, but laws could be changed. If Richard's reign faltered, a future parliament could reverse Titulus Regius and restore their legitimacy, and their very existence would then become a threat. Richard needed not just legal authority, but the elimination of alternative claims, and the logic of his situation pointed in one direction. From the summer of 1483 onward, the princes began to disappear from public view. At first, they were seen occasionally in the grounds of the Tower, playing or taking exercise. Foreign visitors reported glimpses of them at windows. Dominic Mancini, an Italian cleric who was in London during this period, noted that they were seen less and less frequently as the weeks passed, and that rumours were already circulating that they might be harmed. But as summer turned to autumn, the sightings ceased altogether. No announcement was made, no ceremony marked their deaths, if indeed they died. They simply ceased to be visible, and the silence around them became a subject of rumour, speculation, and eventually accusation. By October, when Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, raised a rebellion against Richard, the rebels were openly proclaiming that the princes were dead, and they were using that claim as justification for armed resistance. Buckingham's rebellion is itself a revealing episode, and it requires careful analysis. Buckingham had been Richard's most important ally during the coup. He had been present at Stony Stratford, he had supported the arrest of Rivers, and he had been richly rewarded after Richard's coronation with lands and offices that made him one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Why he turned against Richard so quickly, within 4 months of the coronation, remains unclear. Some contemporary sources suggest that he was influenced by John Morton, Bishop of Ely, a committed Lancastrian who was in Buckingham's custody and who may have convinced him that Richard's position was unsustainable and that the political nation would not tolerate a king suspected of murdering his nephews. Others suggest that Buckingham had his own dynastic ambitions, based on his descent from Edward III, and that he saw Richard's growing unpopularity as an opportunity to advance his own claim to the throne. What is clear is that the rebellion was not an isolated act. It was coordinated with a series of risings across the southern counties, and it was connected to a plan to bring Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant living in exile in Brittany, back to England and place him on the throne. The rebels' proclamation that the princes were dead is significant. It suggests that by October 1483 their disappearance was widely known, that it was being attributed to Richard, and that it was being used as a political weapon against him. Whether the rebels had direct evidence for their claim, or whether they were simply exploiting rumours that were already in circulation, cannot be determined from the sources. But the fact that they made the charge publicly, and that they did so in the context of armed rebellion, indicates that the question of the prince's fate had become a destabilizing force that Richard could not manage through silence. The rebellion also reveals something about the instability of Richard's rule. Within months of his coronation, a significant portion of the southern gentry, including men who had no obvious Lancastrian sympathies and who had served Edward IV loyally, had risen in arms against him. They had done so not in the name of restoring the princes, whose fate they claimed to know, but in support of Henry Tudor, a man whose claim to the throne was so remote that it would have been laughable under normal circumstances. Henry Tudor's lineage was exceptionally weak. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line that had been legitimized in the late 14th century, but explicitly barred from the succession. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been the son of a Welsh squire, and Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, though that marriage had been of questionable validity. Henry himself had spent most of his life in exile and had never held office, commanded troops, or participated in English political life in any meaningful capacity. The fact that substantial numbers of the southern gentry were willing to risk their lives and estates to support him suggests not that they believed in his right to the throne, but that they found Richard's rule intolerable and saw Henry as a vehicle for removing him. The disappearance of the princes had created a political problem that Richard could not solve. As long as their fate remained unannounced and unexplained, it fed suspicion. Once that suspicion hardened into accusation, it became a weapon that could be used to justify rebellion. The rebellion failed. Richard moved quickly, raised troops from his strongholds in the north and the Midlands, and suppressed the risings before they could coalesce into a coordinated military threat. Buckingham was captured in Wales, betrayed by one of his own retainers, and executed in early November at Salisbury. Henry Tudor's invasion fleet, caught by storms in the Channel, never reached England and was forced to return to Brittany. But the speed with which Richard crushed the rebellion did not erase what it had revealed, that his legitimacy was contested, that his association with the disappearance of the princes was damaging his rule, and that even those who had helped him seize power now believed his position was unsustainable. Buckingham's defection was particularly damaging because it suggested that the coalition Richard had assembled was fracturing from within, and that the silence around the prince's fate was creating a political crisis that military force alone could not resolve. The case against Richard as the person responsible for the prince's deaths is built on circumstantial evidence, but that evidence is substantial. He had the clearest motive. As long as the princes lived, they represented a permanent threat to his rule, and the statute that had declared them illegitimate could be reversed by a future parliament. He had the means. The boys were in his custody, held in the Tower of London, which was controlled entirely by his appointees. They were isolated from any family members or protectors who might have intervened on their behalf. He had the opportunity. The period of their disappearance coincides exactly with the consolidation of his rule in the summer and autumn of 1483, and he had already demonstrated through the executions of Hastings, Rivers, Vaughan, and Grey
that he was willing to use lethal force against those he perceived as threats. The pattern of his behavior suggests a man who understood power in ruthlessly practical terms and who was prepared to remove obstacles without regard for legal process or moral constraint. The chroniclers who wrote in the decades following Richard's death had no doubt of his guilt. Dominic Mancini, who left England in the summer of 1483, reported that the princes were seen less and less frequently, and that rumours of their death were already circulating. The Croyland Chronicle, written by someone close to events, noted their disappearance and implied that foul play was suspected. Polydore Virgil, writing under the patronage of Henry VII, stated directly that Richard had ordered the murders.
And Thomas More, writing in the early 16th century, provided the most detailed account, describing how Richard employed a trusted servant named James Tyrrell to smother the boys in their sleep and bury them secretly within the Tower grounds. More's narrative has shaped the popular understanding of the story for centuries, and it formed the basis of Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal of Richard as a hunchbacked villain. But More's account was written more than 30 years after the events, and More himself was a child when the princes disappeared. His sources are not identified, and his narrative is shaped by the political imperatives of the Tudor regime, which required Richard to be portrayed as a tyrant in order to justify Henry's conquest at Bosworth and his seizure of the throne. More's history is a literary achievement, but its value as evidence is limited. The problem is not that Richard is an implausible suspect. The problem is that the evidence is insufficient to support a conclusion beyond reasonable doubt, and there are alternative possibilities that cannot be entirely dismissed. Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at Bosworth in 1485 and claimed the throne as Henry VII, had his own reasons to ensure that no Yorkist claimants survived. If the princes had lived until 1485, Henry would have faced exactly the same threat that Richard had faced, and he might have resolved it in the same manner. Henry's reign was plagued by pretenders claiming to be one or the other of the princes, most notably Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, which suggests that considerable uncertainty about their fate persisted even years after Richard's death. If Henry had ordered their deaths after Bosworth, he would have had every incentive to allow Richard to be blamed, and the Tudor chroniclers who wrote the histories we now rely upon would have had strong reasons to reinforce that narrative. Another possibility, though it rests on thinner evidence, is that Buckingham acted independently, perhaps killing the princes during his period of influence in the summer of 1483, either on his own initiative or in a failed attempt to destabilise Richard's rule and create conditions for his own advancement. A third possibility is that the princes died of natural causes during their confinement, though this seems difficult to reconcile with the complete absence of any official announcement or funeral, which would have been expected even for children who had been declared illegitimate. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen discovered a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase leading to the chapel of the White Tower. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children, one slightly larger than the other. The discovery was immediately associated with the missing princes, and King Charles II ordered that the remains be interred in Westminster Abbey, where they were placed in an urn designed by Christopher Wren. In 1933, the bones were examined by anatomists and a dental surgeon, who concluded that they were consistent with the ages of Edward and Richard at the time of their presumed deaths. But the examination was limited by the standards of the period, the methodology has since been questioned, and the conclusions remain contested. Without DNA testing or radiocarbon dating, the identification is speculative. The bones could belong to the princes, or they could belong to other children who died at another time and for other reasons. Requests to conduct modern forensic analysis have been denied by the authorities responsible for Westminster Abbey, and there is no indication that such testing will be authorised in the foreseeable future. The historiography of the princes in the Tower has evolved considerably over the past century. For most of the period since Richard's death, his guilt was assumed, and the story was told as a straightforward account of murder and usurpation. But in the 20th century, revisionist historians began to challenge that narrative, pointing to the unreliability of Tudor sources, and arguing that Richard had been unfairly condemned by propaganda. The Richard III Society, founded in 1924, has worked systematically to rehabilitate his reputation, and some of its members have argued forcefully that he was innocent, and that the blame should fall elsewhere. Most academic historians today occupy a more cautious position. They acknowledge the biases in the sources, recognise the limits of the evidence, and accept that certainty is not possible. but they also tend to view Richard as the most plausible suspect, based on motive, opportunity, and the pattern of his actions in 1483.
The princes in the Tower disappeared in the summer of 1483. They were never seen again. Whether they were murdered and by whom cannot be answered definitively with the evidence that survives. Their disappearance served Richard's political interests, occurred while they were in his custody, and was never explained by his regime. The historical record contains no funeral, no announcement, no formal recognition of what had occurred. We are left with circumstantial evidence that points in one direction, but cannot exclude others. 2 boys entered the Tower of London in the spring of 1483, and vanished from the documentary record. The silence is absolute, and it has persisted for more than 5 centuries.